Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the Midnight Denver Blogging Edition. I'm Heather Hurlburt from the National Security Network, and with me is...
Matthew Continetti of the Weekly Standard and the K Street Gang. Forgive me, Heather, it took me a second to remember who I was because of the nonstop events here in Denver. Gavel comes to order at about 3 p.m. Mountain Time and then doesn't stop until 9 p.m. 6 hours of speeches and, of course, the mantra again and again, change, change, change.
Now, some people have the idea that Denver is just one crazy party after another, but you were confessing to me that you haven't yet been to a party.
Yes.
Tell the viewers about how hard you're working trying to keep tracks on us dangerous progressives.
I won't bore Blogging Heads viewers with the details of my day, but I'm probably having, I will say, the lamest convention ever because it's all work. And though it is funny to me, going through the extreme security surrounding the Pepsi Arena where the convention is being held. It's funny to me that every 4 years Washington has this quadrennial exercise where it picks two cities to invade and turn into itself for a period of about a week. And so Denver has been transformed into Washington. You have the motorcades with the sirens, you have the ridiculous security and checkpoints in order to get into any event, any place, and of course you have as well the politicians roaming around and the media everywhere. But the one exception that you don't really have in Washington that you do have when Washington invades one of these cities are the fans. And I was just spent the morning walking to the Pepsi Arena. I saw Harold Ford Jr., of course, gave the keynote address in 2000. Now he's, after that failed Senate run in 2006, he's heading the DLC. And he was walking alone on Blake Street in downtown Denver until he was accosted in a very friendly way by a few fans. So that's the one thing that strikes me as missing from D.C. You don't have the groupies, the political groupies in D.C.
I'm laughing because one of the odder political groupie things that I saw happen tonight was I was explaining to Matt that I have been to exactly one party in Denver, but it's one I was hosting, so which I'm not sure that really counts. I did have one glass of wine, so I guess I can't whine about not having any fun. But our bizarre groupie moment was when the kids of a senior Iraqi official mobbed an Obama campaign official.
Oh, really?
So yeah, there's all kinds of groupies here. The sort of two other differences from Washington. One, the fleets of limos are hybrid Chevy Tahoes, which I must say is a most impressive looking vehicle in its largeness. And just the sheer size of the security perimeter, which you could never manage in an eastern city. But Matt has that pale look of someone who has spent all day under the convention hot lights. And me, I tried to sneak into the Pepsi Center at the last possible moment, trading up for credentials as I hiked through the endless security perimeter, only to get to the 50-minute metal detector line, at which point we were put on buses, taken somewhere else to be metal detectored, and then walked back to the convention center. So for all those of you who are sitting at home wondering about what the glamour of political conventions is like, it's 10:30 at night. We're sitting in an unair-conditioned house, having just pulled off what has to be one of the more complex maneuvers in Blogging Heads history, which I just want to brag about for just a minute. We had the camera FedEx to us here this morning. Then we had one driver who's a student from Colorado College, Matt, myself, two of my work colleagues, rendezvous on a completely random street corner in Denver, which was at least a mile, what would you say, a mile and a half from the convention center. Yeah. Then we drove to Matt's car. Then Matt followed our indefatigable student chauffeur out here to the NSN Blogging Heads Denver recording studio, such as it is. So I feel like we deserve some kind of prize for surely the most effort ever undergone to do a Blogging Heads.
Either that or just evidence of how dreary and dismal our lives are, that we go to so much trouble to do a Blogging Heads segment.
No, it's because we love the commenters.
Right, absolutely. Well, let's get to it then. Heather, what were your thoughts about the second night of the Democratic Convention, and of course not the keynote speaker, that was former Virginia Governor Mark Warner, who's running for the Senate from that state, but Hillary Clinton.
Well, look, this was Hillary's night, and she exceeded, I think, every expectation that was set for her in an expectation-setting game that had gotten pretty out of control, both in terms of stepping right up to the podium and saying, you're all here to elect Barack Obama, saying, you weren't really doing this just for me. I want to remind you that you weren't really doing it just for me, reprising some of the best themes from her speech that she gave when she left the race, managing to touch on a bunch of the night's grace notes, managing to hit the Obama campaign's big themes, maintaining her tone throughout. And this was her night. It'll be seen that way. And I really think and I hope that most of the fun media story that has been had this week about disunity in the party will now be over, and you guys will have to find something else.
Well, not so fast. I thought it was an excellent speech. I thought a lot of people in the arena, including me, were probably thinking, maybe she would make just as strong, if not a stronger, general election candidate than Senator Obama. And I think it's important to distinguish between the people on the floor of the convention, which we talk to when you go down there and you talk to the delegates, the pledged delegates for Hillary, who are going to be released tomorrow to go to Obama. And when you talk to them, they're saying, yeah, we're here to support Hillary, but in the end, we're going to support Obama. I think we need to distinguish between them and the broader pool, those 18 million Hillary voters, between a quarter to a half of which, depending on which poll you read, are now contemplating voting for John McCain. I think, yes, a lot of the Democrats are going to come home to their party in November, but I still think that there's a kind of a group of Hillary voters, or people who are inclined to support Hillary Clinton and disinclined to support Senator Obama, who are up for grabs. And the McCain campaign is doing everything they can in order to reach out to them, including releasing ads in the middle of the night featuring disgruntled Hillary delegates, and, of course, hosting a happy hour for Hillary fans in Denver here yesterday. But she did go out of her way. I think you're absolutely right to point out that she went out of her way to say the battle's over, it's time to join forces and take on McCain. And she was very good, I thought, also in attacking John McCain. A lot of Democrats, two Democrats in particular, Paul Begala and James Carville, were complaining last night about this lack of attacks on Senator McCain's record in the first night of the Democratic Convention. Tonight we saw that pick up a little bit. Brian Schweitzer, the governor of Montana, gave an impassioned speech, and we saw it again with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I think the Schweitzer speech is the other one that deserves at least a moment of pause, because I have to say, if you had told me 6, 10, 12 months ago that I would watch the governor of Montana deliver a rousing speech that brought the crowd to its feet, laughing, cheering, and screaming, I would have scratched my head a little bit. But to me, Schweitzer was the sleeper of the night. I mean, we knew Hillary had to be good. We knew she would be good. She was excellent. Schweitzer, I think, a little bit more, or at least to most of us, an unknown quality. And he, not only was it a good speech, but he really read the crowd and picked up as he went along, which is not an easy thing to do, and not something that everybody who gets up in front of a convention manages. So I was most impressed by that one.
Yeah, the thing that we've been seeing with a lot of speakers at this Democratic convention, of course, there's only 1 hour of primetime network television per night, so the schedule's kind of rushed. But what I've noticed with a lot of these speakers is that they step on their applause. I think we saw it with Michelle Obama on night 1. I think we saw it with Hillary Clinton on night 2. They step on their applause because they're so conscious of meeting that network time schedule. The one thing that Brian Schweitzer did, he did not step on his applause.
He was enjoying every moment of it.
He was trying to milk that crowd for everything it had. And they wanted someone to really kind of rouse them and get them excited about it. So it was a success. And of course, people have been watching Schweitzer since he was elected several years ago. Kind of the first wave of this Democratic. Or rather, the first, maybe an harbinger of this Democratic wave that's been sweeping the Mountain West, that continued in 2006 with John Tester being elected to the Senate from Montana, and may continue, probably will continue in a lot of the down ticket races at least, in 2008.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other fascinating things about tonight is the message was much less what was said than who was saying it. And if you think you had Casey, Famous, son of Bob Casey, famously denied a speaking slot conventions in the past to say, hey, the tent is big enough for me. You had Deval Patrick, an early Obama supporter and a very highly regarded governor. You had Schweitzer. You had Mark Warner, former presidential candidate, very highly regarded former governor and Senate candidate. So you had Senator Clinton, spanning the whole range of experience, personal history, partisanship, all getting up and talk. And so that to me by itself was sort of an interesting message of tonight, that you could put this many different folks together and still come out with as you were saying, a fairly unified message, even if I think for you a little too unifying after you spent that many hours in the booth listening to it.
Well, we're getting ready to, compile the Democratic National Convention drinking game, and there should be a Republican National Convention edition. But tonight's drinking phrases, though I did not have a drink when I heard these phrases, but if I were to have had one, the phrases would have been 95%, which was a reference to McCain voting with George Bush 95% of the time. The change we need, that's another phrase that's being repeated throughout this convention, versus more of the same. And of course, as the Democrats were attacking McCain for being more of the same, it kind of occurred to me, wouldn't it be funny if at the Republican National Convention next week, the entire crowd just burst into chants of more of the same, more of the same. But of course, that's the fantasy of some strange guy like myself.
I was to say, you have been here too long. If you're the Weekly Standard guy, and that's your fantasy, you've been here. We need to send him a care package.
But I do think that Democrats have been very successful so far in linking McCain to Bush. This is something that I was always skeptical of being able to do, because McCain isn't Bush. I mean, he's not a doctrinaire conservative. He's not a doctrinaire Republican. And yet the message of this convention, even though the attacks have been fairly muted so far, in my opinion, I think they are making an effective claim that Bush and McCain are linked. And of course, the best line of the night was Hillary Clinton's in her speech, saying, it's no surprise that the Republicans are holding the convention in the Twin Cities, because these days it's so hard to tell George Bush from John McCain. I thought that of course, will be the soundbite of the night, repeated over and over again, and a very good rhetorical gift from Senator Clinton to Senator Obama.
Now, and speaking of gifts, I mean, the reason that the Democrats are having success in doing that is that McCain has not succeeded in defining himself as something else, which surprises me. But that he has left himself open, most notably on national security, the area that I work on, but on a number of other issues as well. He has left himself open to be defined as just like Bush, which, as I say, surprises me a little bit. And where they've tried to differentiate themselves, it's by taking out this one ad that says we're not better off than we were 8 years ago, rather than by really finding some coherent policy alternatives to hammer home. Yeah. So again, that's surprised me. The McCain operation hasn't seemed to focus on that, and I guess that's something we'll be looking for when you go to Minneapolis next week.
Right. Well, McCain, I think you hit on something there. It's interesting. McCain has mainly run a campaign about himself, about his own history, about his own service to the country, and about his own leadership on certain issues. On foreign policy, it'd be his leadership with the surge, and his leadership in responding to the Russian aggression in Georgia. And domestic policy, there's not much. McCain's kind of in a tight spot, because those issues on which he's shown leadership in the past, things like campaign finance reform, things like immigration reform, those cut against the base of his party, and so the McCain campaign, understandably, is reluctant to bring it up. It's the burden that a true post-partisan, in some ways, like John McCain, carries, because he's at odds with his party on so many issues, and it's always interesting to see how he deals with that. Before we talk about, I know we want to get to your topic of expertise and my topic of dilettantism, but before we get to foreign policy, what were your thoughts on the keynote address of the night from Mark Warner?
Well, three things. First, that the fascinating thing about John McCain is that he's at odds with his party over so many fewer things than he used to be, which is another thing that muddies the waters for him trying to define himself. So Mark Warner, the fascinating thing about the Warner speech is that it set out to be something very different from the sort of usual keynote, it did not set out to be Ann Richards, to cite the most famous, or one of the most famous examples, that it very deliberately set out to be post-partisan. And you actually had a piece predicting that it would flop, and but saying the reason it would flop is that it's hard for a moderate to be. And I would argue that it succeeded, but on its own terms. And so if you were expecting Ann Richards, you were disappointed. But if you knew Governor Warner, you knew in advance you weren't going to get Ann Richards. But if you were expecting somebody who's a charismatic, interesting figure to set out, sort of another vision of what does this post-partisan approach to the world look like in action, and tell you about what they achieved in Virginia, then that's what you got. And, as you said, there's definitely a sense in which biting partisanship makes better TV, but Warner was given that slot to present a vision of something different about how Obama wants American politics to work, and I think he did that, which also my drinking games for the night, one of them would have been first in my family to go to college.
Right.
Which is quite extraordinary, and it's a real...
Working families.
Working families.
That's another one.
Right.
Middle class agenda.
Yes, middle class agenda, and the economy, of course, which was the theme of much of the night. Before we got to prime time, but you had the Jennifer Granholm Economic Town Hall. Being a former Michigander, I have a soft spot for Governor Granholm, so we had to sneak her in somewhere. But that's my shtick on Warner. So by your standard, Warner failed success.
Well, neither really. I thought the speech was interesting. I agree with you there. I don't know if Mark Warner could be described as charismatic. I mean, he's a technocrat.
In the Virginia context.
There are more charming Virginia politicians, I suppose. I don't know. I'm actually going through my head. A lot of Virginia politicians aren't that charming. But
I'll just stand by my point.
Well, Warner's, the most curious part of Warner's speech to me was his celebration of his own wealth. And I understand that it's part of his, narrative of going, rising up and pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. But when he starts talking, he presented a very interesting narrative of how he became so filthy rich. His fortune is estimated in the hundreds of millions. And it was that a friend of his told him about this new technology, car phones. And of course, the story is a little bit more complicated. Warner worked in the FCC during the Carter years, and it was government connections that he had during that period of his life that enabled him to kind of find out about this new technology, and of course, invest in Nextel, or what became Nextel. And it was a smart move on his part to do that, but the story a little bit more complicated than that which he presented.
Right, but you see, Democrats believe in the role of government.
Yeah. Well, no, then maybe they should just celebrate that, right? And say, oh, look at this, DARPA led to the internet, and Mark Warner's FCC connections led to, Nextel and cell phones in every home. I
have to say, I've written one too many energy policy speeches that DARPA featured in, and I'm just as grateful that nobody brought it up.
Well, I just like saying DARPA. That just sounds fun for me.
That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, for those of you following along at home.
No, I thought Warner's speech was pretty good. I don't think it's going to be remembered years from now, and that's the measuring stick that I used when I talked about how liberals just give better speeches at Democratic conventions than moderates. I mean, you look, not even keynotes. I mean, you look at Ted Kennedy's famous speech in 1980, and of course, if you go to the keynotes, Cuomo in 84, and Richards in 88, Barack Obama in 2004. These are big liberals, and they give good speeches, and I think the reason they do that is they have a strong ideology, and they're not afraid to be partisan in these types of contexts. If you're talking about Ann Richards, right, or Mario Cuomo, what made those speeches so good is the forcefulness of their attacks on the incumbent president or incumbent vice president running for president in George H.W. Bush's case. And that takes a partisan to launch an attack. What struck me is, you compare even the attacks on John McCain so far in this convention to the attacks on John Kerry at the 2004 RNC. There's no contest. I mean, the Democrats really are not attacking McCain as harshly as the Republicans attacked Kerry in 2004. And the thing is about attacks, they work. And so I would expect tomorrow night that Joe Biden and Bill Clinton raise the bar on the attacks a little bit more to the Democrats' ultimate advantage. And of course, Heather, the theme tomorrow night is your specialty, right?
National security.
Yeah. And so what do you expect to hear from the candidates tomorrow?
So tomorrow we're going to see a parade of progressive national security leaders, which is going to be quite impressive. A reminder that there are a serious group of folks out there, former military folks, elected, current and former electeds, military folks. And the thing that I think is so impressive about this year, even compared to 4 years ago, is that you have the Democrats saying, look, we're going to take this issue head on. Really, in a way, even more so than was done with Kerry 4 years ago, where you had the salute to a bunch of generals on the stage, and then you had the reporting for duty thing. But other than that, really not all that much of a national security motif at the convention. Whereas here, this time, you have a whole day and a significant chunk of the program that is devoted to national security speaking. You have tonight. You had your choice of multiple national security themed events to go to. Tomorrow you do as well, and really sort of pointing out the degree to which the Democratic Party has rebuilt for itself a serious national security infrastructure, which my outfit plays a very small part in, but which culminates, when you bring on Joe Biden, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to talk both. So I think you're going to hear quite a bit about what's gone wrong, but you're also going to hear quite a bit about how it could go right. You're going to hear a lot about respect for the troops. No surprise there. You're going to hear a lot about keeping promises to the troops. I think you're going to, in the vein of sharpened attacks, you're going to hear a lot about Senator McCain not bothering to show up for the GI Bill vote. You're going to hear a lot about some of his other votes. You're going to hear a lot about rebuilding respect for America in the world in order to get things done in a pragmatic, goal-oriented way. Just understanding that in a complicated world, you sometimes need other people to help you do things, and it's a lot easier to do that if they respect you to start with. And you mentioned the Russia-Georgia situation, which is an excellent one, where everyone agrees that Russia's behavior has been outrageous, and the situation is bad, and there need to be consequences. But the ugly truth is that we're having a little trouble in terms of leverage, and part of the reason for that is that the policy was let go for so long, and you had these policies that relied on people that were a Putin policy rather than a Russia policy, a Musharraf policy instead of a Pakistan policy. If I wanted to be really unkind, I would say it was a look into his eyes policy instead of a strategic national security policy. So I think you're going to hear a critique, but you're also going to hear, and because this is something that Obama does, I think, really well, and that he blends his personal story with a strong national security narrative, talking about how, because Americans know we're in a hole and want to hear about how it can be better, don't want to hear about how bad it is. Beyond a certain point, it's one of our more or less endearing national characteristics. So are going to hear about how there is a strong democratic vision to turn this around, starting with responsibly leaving Iraq and putting our troops where they can do more good and come back and rebuild and fix our military.
Yeah, I think the Democrats are on weaker ground tomorrow than they were today. The Democrats enjoy huge advantages on economic issues, on domestic issues when it comes to public polling. But if you look at any poll about Barack Obama, the voters continue to have concerns about his inexperience and about his ability to become commander-in-chief. And so these are issues in which they trust McCain more than they trust Obama. I do think you're absolutely right that I doubt we're going to see a defensive Democratic Party tomorrow night on the issues of national security. I don't know whether that's necessarily to their ultimate advantage. The forces in the party that have been emboldened over the last 2 years are the forces of dovishness. It's a good thing that Biden's on the ticket because he is one Democrat who is an advocate for the use of force on many occasions, including the vote to authorize the war in Iraq in 2002, the vote that Obama claimed really made his claim to the presidency, or at least the Democratic presidential nomination, on an issue in which they disagree. So I don't know, if we're going to go too. I don't expect the Dems to go too far in the whole "it's time to negotiate with dictators" line, which Obama has continued to defend that that spur-of-the-moment policy decision he made at the YouTube debate last summer. But I think you will hear about forceful, standing for American principles. Though at Georgia even, I've been struck at the convergence, actually, between the two parties on the issue of Georgia. Biden returned from Georgia just last week, claiming that Saakashvili's government needed to be supported. Richard Hurlburt, who is likely to have a high-profile job in an Obama administration, has been very forceful in his defense of Georgia and his support for Saakashvili. And Obama, too, continues to support NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine. On this issue, there is no difference between the two parties.
No, which I think really sort of leads me to want to push back very strongly. I mean, I want to know where the forces of dovishness are that are in the ascendance of the Democratic Party. You've got Barack Obama, who says, we'll unilaterally go after terrorists in Pakistan if we need to. You've got Joe Biden. You've got Hillary Clinton. I'm thinking about who some of the other top vice presidential contenders were. Evan Bayh, not exactly a noted dove, Jack Reed. So I strenuously dispute the idea that there's dovish. I mean, I would sort of argue the forces of sanity are what have the upper hand. And at any event, going back to your very first point, the gap between Republicans and Democrats in public opinion on national security is the smallest it has been in, I think it's 15.
That's parties. I'm talking about the candidates.
But the thing that we learned in 2004 is that whether you're out ahead as we are on all aspects of foreign policy except the military, or whether you're behind, you actually can't afford to sit and wait to be attacked. And this is, of course, a position that the Republicans have worked from on other issues for years. When you find yourself down is a fine time to go on the attack. So the thing that Democrats learned decisively in 2006 and used very effectively is don't wait. Go ahead and define yourself on national security before you let the Republicans redefine you. So, and I think the other point to make is that the economy night tonight went first because we see that that's where the public says its first, second, and third concerns are right now. But we also see a number of really strong economic concerns like oil prices that do have that national security link. And we see very clearly with a group of much coveted swing voters that national security issues form a kind of threshold where if people may ultimately vote on pocketbook issues or values issues, but as a candidate, you've got to make the case, you've got to make a minimal case on national security to get in the door. So that is the thinking that leads you to do a full night on national security and really come out very strongly on it and say, no, we're not at such a disadvantage on this that we shouldn't try to fight.
Mm-hmm. I think it's to the Democrats' advantage and to Barack Obama's advantage that national security concerns have receded among the electorate at large, and that the dominant issue on voters' minds is the economy. I mean, it'd be hard to argue otherwise, I think. And when it comes to dovishness, two policies in particular. One is with Iran and Obama's willingness to meet with whoever he thinks is in charge there at the moment. And, of course, on Iraq, where Obama has been, he was against the war. Then he had the period when he first came to the Senate where he said his policy on Iraq was pretty much indistinguishable from Bush's. And then, of course, he was against... he was for withdrawing when Iraq went down the tubes in 2006. And then he was against the surge, which has done so much to help Iraq maintain some semblance of stability and peace in the past few months. So there he continues to pull for this timeline of 16 months to responsibly pull our troops, combat troops from Iraq. Now he is helped by the fact that that's where everybody's headed anyway, including the Bush administration. And so that's one issue where the Democrats' dovishness probably won't hurt them in the end, simply because the Iraq War, I would argue, is being won, and it's no longer an issue, actually. It's no longer, if you look at the contention, the real contention between the two parties, or at least the two candidates, not among the American people, who are all with the Democrats on this, but the real contention between the two candidates is whether it was a mistake to have the war to start with. But,
Well, yeah, I was going to say the reason the debate is all but over about it is that the public is under the impression the debate is over and is just waiting for someone to carry out what they wanted. But on this, just to go on a little more about this point of dovishness, was it dovish when Ronald Reagan met with Gorbachev? Was it dovish when Nixon met with the Chinese? Was it dovish for George W. Bush to negotiate with Gaddafi?
Right. Well, the
so-
thing is, those negotiations happened from a position of strength, and I think actually because of the success we're seeing in Iraq, you could argue that we will be in a position of strength in the Middle East that would be open. In fact, there are some conservatives, including Ruel Gerecht and Robert Kagan, the feared neoconservatives, who are for actually an offer of direct negotiations with the Iranians. And the question is whether that would actually prevent the Iranians from continuing on their quest for nuclear power and or nuclear weapons, and the answer, I think, is a pretty obvious no, because the Iranians want nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
Well, I tell you, the greatest position of weakness we could find ourselves in is to make it clear that where you have the Iraqis asking for a timetable, the Bush administration appearing to agree to a timetable, and John McCain saying, no, we can't possibly have a timetable. So if you make it clear that the Iraqis don't want us there anymore, but we're going to try to stay anyway, that to me is the supreme position of weakness, where it does become impossible or very difficult to deal with.
Right. I'm not sure that's John McCain's position either.
But
what is John
McCain's
Well,
position?
John McCain.
It's an excellent question.
John McCain is for a conditions-based withdrawal from Iraq. Right. That's the position, and we're getting to the point in Iraq now where the conditions favor the withdrawal of forces, and you do that in Obama's phrase, and you know better than I do, in that responsible way. It's easy to get distracted as Iraq now becomes a political issue rather than a military one.
Yeah, it really has been for well over a year. My pollster friends sort of like to scandalize people about a year and a half ago by saying that Iraq was no longer a foreign policy issue. It was, but I have to say I did miss the point where McCain said simply and clearly, "I'm for a conditions-based withdrawal."
Well, I think if you looked at his speech earlier this year, kind of a speech that failed in a lot of ways, but the speech in which he looked back on the first 4 years of his administration, in which he said most of our
the
troops
Mets
would be
win
gone.
the World Series, big
The
rock
weird
candy
kind of
speech. Yes,
that kind of weird speech. But in there, it's clear that, and that's a position. This is the Petraeus position as well. When Petraeus first came to Congress.
I didn't take away from that the troops were going to be gone in 2012. I understood
that he said that. So
I thought that violence was at manageable levels and we had won in 2012.
No, I think both of those things may well be true in 2012. But I think he also said in that speech that the troops would be coming home. In fact, he got slammed in the media at the time, as I recall, because I was participating in his argument. He got slammed because it was like, oh, is that John McCain's timeline? But as Iraq becomes a political issue, not a military one, and also a contentious foreign policy issue diplomatically between the United States and Iraq because of the nature of Iraqi politics, it can be easy to, a lot of the rhetoric masks the underlying realities. And so Maliki's had a very strong position in terms of American withdrawal, with an eye, of course, to the domestic politics and the election. So we'll see what the situation is. My underlying point, though, is that the situation in Iraq now helps Obama because it's no longer a contentious one among elites in both parties.
Well, on that note of agreement, it's probably time, since tomorrow is creeping ever closer,
Absolutely.
to say goodnight, and we'll see you on the floor tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heather.
Blogging. Thank you.